Good. We're in business. It's all yours.
Great. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And it's a particular pleasure to be sharing the stage, as it were, with Inu. We go back a long ways to American University, where we were both students of Robert Pastor, one of the great thinkers and proponents of a North American vision. I'm going to, you do not currently see my slides, right? I think they have.
I can see them. They're on my screen. I'm not
Oh,
sure.
they are on your screen.
Yeah.
Well, good. They're not on mine, but that's okay. I think I can toggle over to a different screen. I didn't realize they'd been up this whole time. Sorry for that. So we seem to be living in a moment of mini global crises. Of course, the world's attention in recent days has been on Yemen, questions of shipping in the Red Sea, on the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, on the war in Ukraine, on rising tensions in the wake of Taiwan's election. And amidst all of these issues, North America gets very little attention. In fact, a few months ago, when we were scheduling this talk, I'd very much hoped that the talk would coincide with the 11th edition of the North American Leaders Summit. But that trilateral meeting of US, Canadian, and Mexican heads of state remains unscheduled, though initially these were precisely the dates when that Canadians had been hoping to hold it, I understand. But for North America, that's sort of a slight. Getting bumped once again seems almost expected and taken for granted. Today, as Greg suggested, I want to try to put North America in a global context in terms of its emergence, its development, and its future, and think of this in part in terms of how the global context affects how we may move forward with North America. Because in a sense, of course, we're always living in a moment of different crises, and North America has very often been swept aside on the US agenda anyway by those crises. That is, I think, much less true for Canada and Mexico, where attention to North America has been more consistent. North America instead is often approached kind of through on the US agenda as sitting at the intersection of domestic politics and economics. My contention then is that the region's evolution has been and will continue to be deeply shaped by its place in the world, despite the fact that we often overlook North America as a global region at all. Let me see if I can manage to change slides. Did that change slides as well?
Yes, it did.
Oh, excellent. Oh, always a bit of a leap of faith. And then secondly, what I want to do is to argue that though it's been overlooked, North America deserves a second look. And that now, 30 years after the region's founding pact, the North American Free Trade Agreement, took effect, is a perfect time to do that. Although the United States has had a tendency, going back at least to the Second World War, to focus its attention much further afield, North America has been central to the security and prosperity of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. These are the two books on screen that Greg mentioned, and I just wanted to highlight them because I'll be drawing on them quite liberally. They're both books I've co-edited. The first is a policy volume that was released with the Wilson Center, co-edited with Alan Burson, who himself has played a central role in some of the policy developments regarding North America at DHS and elsewhere. The second is a more academic volume co-edited with Eric Hirschberg that looks at North America in the context of international relations. On those two, if you happen to be in Washington, I'd be pleased to share to see some of you next week at American University. I'll be in Washington for an event that launches that latter book and also serves as a sort of commemoration of 10 years of the since the passing of Inu and I's former professor, Robert Pastor. And I also wanted to mention that you can get an online copy of this of the Wilson Center book for free if you scan that QR code or if you just search for it online. It should pop up and you can download a PDF of a collection in which Inu also has a chapter, but that covers really a broad spectrum of issues of relevance for North America, not just its place in the world, which I'll be talking about mostly today, but also many of the transnational challenges and opportunities that the United States, Canada, and Mexico face in their economies and their securities and the management of their shared borders and more. So I want to start with this sort of prompt or question: where in the world is North America, and what exactly is North America? When we look at the globe, of course, it's easy enough to find North America, but in discussions of global politics, North America is much less present than other regions, certainly less present than Europe, and also less present in a sense than Asia or even South America. Elsewhere, summits of world leaders often draw headlines and bright lights, but in contrast, North America's summits, when supposedly its leaders step out together on the world stage, have often been last-minute additions to the calendar or have fallen off the schedule altogether. Indeed, after the so-called Three Amigos Summit started with great fanfare under President George W. Bush from 2005 to 2009, North American leaders drifted apart. The countries only managed to hold 3 meetings during the next 11 years, and none at all under President Trump. And although those meetings have returned to the schedule under President Biden, again they, as I suggested, with the absence of the current 2024 edition from the calendar, they've often been kind of secondary priorities. It's with this sort of focus, this sort of absence in mind, that the Oxford professor Andrew Hurrell nearly 20 years ago dubbed North America a region that dare not speak its name. And indeed, in Canada, Mexico, and the United States, as Hurrell pointed out then, and I think the same is true now, political leaders rarely talk about North America, at least explicitly. And when they do, it's not always pretty. This sort of quip from Hurrell seems all the more prescient and fitting. Oops, sorry about that. In the context of the USMCA, as Jaime Serra, one of the principal Mexican architects of the North American Free Trade Agreement, recently said, he bemoaned the loss of the words North America from the Regions Pact in the USMCA. He said, quote, "And now they've put the name USMCA. The name doesn't seem very fitting to me. NAFTA was a treaty of free trade in North America. The concept of the region is important. So why do you take away North America?" And I think that taking away of North America from the name of our central agreement was, first of all, no coincidence. NAFTA, as it were, had something of a branding problem from the very beginning. And also, I should mention, taking away free trade was also a coincidence. And I also think that it's something that has consequences, though they're consequences that are hard to observe. That is, they have consequences in other parts of the world thinking about us as a region. And when we look around the world, we see that other countries, other regions generally do not approach North America as a region. So, and nor does North America approach those other countries as a region. So the United States, or the approach of the United States, Canada, and Mexico to the European Union in trade questions has been highly fragmented, again, with, I think, negative consequences for integration in North America. China does not approach North America as a region, and I think often tries to divide and conquer, or did for a long time. And this makes it very difficult, the sort of lack of a common conceptualization of North America as an international region makes it very difficult to approach other parts of the world with a common agenda. Likewise, the field of international relations, which is my academic home, and the field of area studies do not approach North America as a region. So this is just one way to look at that sort of a question. The number of area studies centers that are designated national resource centers in the United States. And what we see is the United States dedicates a great deal of attention to studying nearly every region in the world except the region in which it resides. Going outside of official national resource centers, the picture is not a lot better. There are just a handful of programs and centers at U.S. universities that study North America as a region. And if we look to Canada and Mexico, the number of centers studying North America as a region has diminished over time. As I mentioned, I think this is in part because of how North America has long been positioned sort of at this domestic international divide. Long ago, Bob Pastor called North America a piñata for pandering pundits. And to some extent, I think U.S. politicians still tend to see North America that way and avoid talking about it. Interestingly, though, this hasn't always been in line with how the U.S. public sees its neighbors, or the role of the region more, or the role of cooperation in the region more generally. So while opinions of NAFTA were often relatively bleak in the United States, opinions of the USMCA have been very positive. Likewise, opinions of sort of favorability ratings to Canada are almost always very high. Regarding Mexico, they vary a little bit more with political campaigns and events, but remain relatively high. And the US public, in recent surveys, sees Canada and Mexico overwhelmingly as necessary partners. The US public has also had pretty strong and favorable opinions of international trade and regional trade. A study that I did with two colleagues, Clarissa Perez Armendariz and Malcolm Fairbrother, also suggested that across North America, there's a great deal of support amongst the public for cooperation on different issues. That is, cooperation on questions of environment, economic questions outside of trade, in the management of borders, etc. And that sometimes that sort of the degree of support for cooperation was very often much higher than the degree of support for NAFTA when approached as such, or even than trade. As I mentioned, I want to spend just a few minutes kind of putting North America in a global context, taking it out of the way that it's normally approached through dual bilateral relations and intermestic issues, or its place within U.S. politics. Because North America though its origin story is relatively well known, I think it's worth pausing for a moment and putting that origin story within the moment in which North American free trade becomes a reality. When discussions of North American free trade took off, it was, of course, also the moment of the end of the Cold War. The fall of the Berlin Wall is happening nearly at the same time that discussions between the United States and Canada on free trade take off, and just shortly prior to the expansion of discussions on free trade between the United States and Mexico that would give birth to the trilateral agreement. This global context mattered quite a lot. In particular, it mattered for how Mexican leaders saw their position in the world. Mexican leaders looked at what was happening in Europe, not just the fall of the Berlin Wall, but the signing of the Treaty of Maastricht and the greater consolidation of the European Union, and saw a world in which they anticipated the emergence of different geoeconomic blocks. And their primary concern was that Mexico not be left behind in a coming world order characterized by economic regions. And it was that concern and that impetus coming from the global level that spurred Carlos Salinas and many of his advisors to take an older idea of free trade in North America much more seriously, and to approach the United States with that proposal. The signing of NAFTA then leads to a relative boom in a period in which I think the global context was quite harmonious. The global context facilitates the expansion and greater integration of North America between 1994 and 2000, despite the fact that this period also kicks off with a dramatic currency and economic crisis, as well as a political crisis in Mexico. Oops, oh my. Do you see a graph on that under growth in trade? Or
No,
is this
do not.
another mystery of teams? Sorry about that. There should be a graph there showing the growth in free trade in North America over time, is to highlight the quickness with which North American free trade grew during that period of 1994 to 2000. Of course, it was the period in it was two events that to an extent brought that period to a close. The first was of course the September 11th, 2001 attacks in the United States, and the effects that had on the borders, both with Canada and with Mexico. The sort of the thickening of those borders eroded some of North America's regional advantage. And the second, and related to that eroding regional advantage, was China's inclusion in the World Trade Organization, which leads to some significant shifts in global trade patterns. What happens, just to move ahead, during that initial period and of a boom is not just a growth in trade, but the emergence of a shared production platform in which the three North American countries are not just trading finished goods, but really start to build goods together, making North America a much more globally competitive region. After those sort of twin shocks of 2001, however, North America enters a period of drift in which there's a lack of institutional innovation and change, despite the fact that the global context is changing very dramatically. And so the institutions created by NAFTA, I think, over time are less and less apt to the global context in which they function. And Though trade does continue to grow in total terms, at least after it rebounds from a bad period in 2001 and 2002, trade starts to grow again. But what I want to point out in this figure is that trade within North America grows much less rapidly than trade overall. So what we look at is intra-North American trade as a percentage of North America's total trade with the world, or with the United States total trade with the world, falls. Right, so the relative importance of North American trade diminishes. And again, this is largely an effect, of course, of the dramatic expansion of Chinese manufacturing, Chinese exports, initially mostly to the United States, but very quickly also to Canada and Mexico. This diminishes Mexico's comparative advantage quite dramatically, and China becomes, in the words of one Mexican economist, NAFTA's uninvited guest. As I mentioned, this period sort of wraps up with a relative disconnect between the institutions of North America, of NAFTA, and the global context. And so in that sense, the opening of a renegotiation of NAFTA was not necessarily a bad thing, although unfortunately it happened under a context in which the United States neighbors perceived the renegotiation as something quite coercive in a sense, and made those negotiations more tense than one would like if the goal was to produce and enhance North America's regional competitiveness. However, just to skip ahead, this renegotiation also presented something of an opportunity for renewal, one that unfortunately I think has not been entirely seized, despite the fact that we have seen a tremendous resurgence and recovery of North American trade in the wake of the pandemic. And we've seen an expansion of North American trade, including recent figures suggest Mexico claiming the top spot as the #1 exporter to the United States and displacing China. So we have seen some sort of return of North America in this context. But I think given that the global deck today is really being reshuffled, this is precisely the moment in which North American leaders should be stepping out together and emphasizing why, amidst all of these global crises, North America is of primary importance. That is, in periods of crisis, if one looks back, it is often to the United States' own region that US foreign policymakers have turned to defend the prosperity and security of the United States. And so that's my hope, that we will have, again, the North American Leaders Summit being put back on the schedule, but also that it's put back on the schedule in a way in which there is a common agenda, there's a common sort of speaking about North America and its importance, its relevance as a global region that helps shift our understanding of North America away from solely the intermestic or its domestic political role, and places North America on a global map of world regions. So I'll go ahead and stop there, because I want to leave plenty of time for Inu and also for discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Inu, if you come up, perfect. You're off mute and the floor is yours. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Tom, for setting the stage for my discussion as well. And I completely agree that there is a unique opportunity, often in times of crisis, where we start thinking again about North America as a place to begin solving some of our challenges. But I have to say that studying the North American region often feels like a perpetual state of deja vu. Every few years, there are a new set of initiatives that aim to enhance economic integration or to facilitate cooperative efforts at the border. But when you peel back all those layers of the official statements and the press releases, there's almost always a realization that the only difference between these and past efforts are a change in the title or the acronym. Now, part of the reason for this stems from the very nature of our political systems, particularly in the United States, where a change in leadership at the top can alter the content, the scope, and the ambition of regional efforts. Now, this would not be as large as the problem necessarily if it were not for the institutional deficits of NAFTA and the USMCA, which Tom mentioned, that have really failed to create a robust cooperative environment where we don't need to rely on executive leadership for the institutions to function. As Tom also said, the Three Amigos summits have withered for years, and then the committees that monitor the different aspects of the agreement have also shown few results. The tragedy, of course, is that there is tremendous continuity in the set of issues that Canada, Mexico, and the United States have as primary concerns, but that progress is sometimes thwarted by a lack of vision on how to address them. Instead of looking for new approaches, we tend to recycle the old. But there is one period of history that I think the intellectual debates on North American regionalism were especially rich and provided the space not only for the exploration of truly novel ideas for how to move the continent forward on things like trade, environment, security, and labor, but also to how to think North American first and the rest of the world together. So that period begins with the negotiations of the NAFTA, which revitalized the region as an interesting area of study and also spurred many political scientists, sociologists, historians, and economists to investigate the new opportunities for regional development. My own interest in trade started from studying North American integration and has bedded ever since. At the time of NAFTA's negotiation, though, experts had looked to regional projects in other parts of the world for inspiration, with the European Union's experiment at ever closer union serving as the strongest example from which North America could borrow. Now, scholars from US-Mexico relations were obviously aware of the limitations to replicating this model, not least because of the sharp asymmetry in power and development between those two nations. Therefore, they began to identify a new way forward that would select elements of European integration that could best be adapted to the North American context. But the ideas that emerged from this period suffered from quite a significant setback after 9/11, which not only shuffled North American priorities to raise security issues to prominence, but also reinforced US unilateralism, as well as the dual bilateral nature of North American relations, since cooperation on security issues has always been a little easier with Canada as opposed to Mexico. In many ways, policymakers put North America on the back burner, and NAFTA fell into autopilot, its institutional gaps largely unaddressed. Recently, in my own research, I've been revisiting some of those ideas that emerged during that time to identify how the region can today be leveraged to deal with modern challenges that we can't as a country tackle alone. I want to focus this discussion on three areas that I think warrant a fresh regional approach, where there are lessons that can be drawn from the EU's experiments that can help inform our policy approaches on this continent. The first is strengthening our regional trade relationship in the face of shocks. The second is to improve social cohesion through economic opportunity and development in disadvantaged regions, particularly in Mexico. And third is cooperation on one of the major existential threats of our time, climate change. Now, the first two ideas borrow from old EU approaches and tailors them for the North American context. And the third takes a look at the new approach that is gaining traction, not just in the EU, but around the world. So I'll address each of these in turn. Let's start with trade. As Tom mentioned, Canada and Mexico are the United States' top trading partners. Those links have grown stronger as geopolitical tensions have risen with China. That makes sense given the increased policy interest in things like friendshoring and building resilience in supply chains. In finding some alternatives to trading with China, the United States has and does often look to its neighbors. Now, NAFTA liberalized most trade between the three countries, and the USMCA largely preserved those obligations, with the exception of automotive rules of origin, which were tightened to reduce inputs from Canada, particularly from Mexico. Now, that issue was the subject of a recent dispute, which Canada and Mexico won, but the United States has yet to comply with. The North American automotive market, as many of you all know, is very highly integrated, which has allowed it to stay competitive. It's the third largest motor vehicle manufacturer in the world. Reducing trade frictions is thus essential to maintaining a vibrant North American automotive market, but other sectors, in addition to autos, could be examined as candidates for deeper integration, such as in semiconductors and in environmental technologies. Now, to some extent, the United States might pursue this through a new initiative that was launched by the Biden administration called the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. But if you look at what has come out of its first meeting that happened in November, the trade initiatives remain quite underdeveloped. But there's another persistent trade issue that I think deserves attention and could assist with economic integration and trade deepening here at home, particularly in new and emerging technologies. And that issue is regulatory cooperation. If we look at efforts in the European Union, they tackled the challenge of regulatory cooperation quite early on when they realized that the single market could not be constructed if the tyranny of small differences in countries' product regulations could not be harmonized. So for instance, what could be considered jam? I am not joking, there was actually a directive called the Jam Directive where they tried to figure this out because different European countries consider different consistencies of preserved fruits to be jam. And this was something that was quite difficult to solve. Also, what is the appropriate length for a washing machine's electrical cord? And what information should be inside the leaflet of over-the-counter prescriptions? These may seem like small issues, but they tend to be quite large barriers to trade that can develop over time. And while NAFTA had removed a lot of the tariff barriers, the regulatory barriers, many of them remained in place. Now, the EU's approach was to tackle this in three different ways. One was where you harmonize regulations and standards, you all adopt the same thing. The second was through mutual recognition, where you have a conformity assessment in the market that's exporting to ensure that it falls within the rules of the market that's importing. And then you have something called equivalence, where you basically say that the inspection regimes are equal and they achieve the same objective. So you allow those products to enter each market when it conforms to the exporting markets trades regulations. So in 2011, Canada, Mexico, United States actually attempted to do something about this. And it was the regulatory cooperation councils that were started under the Obama administration. And there were two of them. They were to do bilateral councils. Now, the Canada-US side had quite a few achievements, but the US-Mexico Council did not really get very far. And right when it seemed like they were starting to outline clear work plans and developing ideas of how to remove some regulatory barriers to trade, the Trump administration sort of pushed these initiatives to the wayside. But we were saved by the fact that some of these initiatives were embedded in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. Now, that resides in the Good Regulatory Practices chapter of the USMCA, which is yet to be fully utilized to advance the regulatory cooperation agenda that cuts unnecessary regulatory barriers and identifies the emerging areas that will be ripe for cooperation, such as AI and environmental tech. Now, the major difference, I would say, from the EU approach is that North American integration has always been more bottom-up than it has been top-down. And it's always involved industry at every stage of the process. So a new tool that I think could advance this could be found in the competition chapter of the USMCA that could convene stakeholders from all three countries to develop areas of focus. This would help policymakers better prioritize limited resources for regulatory cooperation efforts because they entail using existing regulatory capabilities. And these two institutional features of USMCA together could potentially work together to improve our regional competitiveness. And I think that would be in the tremendous advantage to the United States to do so, particularly if it's starting to friendshore and to look away from multilateral initiatives. Now, the second issue that I think we can learn a lot from past initiatives is on social cohesion. If we look back to the founding of NAFTA, it was the first trade agreement that included a developing country and two rich developed countries. And there were a lot of questions of whether this could work. Some thought that NAFTA maybe could potentially be a model for development and help Mexico climb up the income ladder. The peso crisis made that goal challenging in the years immediately following NAFTA's passage, but Mexico has developed as a trading powerhouse and strengthened its link with its northern neighbors in the process. However, if we look at development in Mexico, it was not even. The border regions benefited by their proximity to the United States to take part in just-in-time production. Southern regions of Mexico lack the infrastructure investments to provide access to trade opportunities. And of course, Mexico's economic challenges following the peso crisis, as well as law enforcement challenges around the drug trade and the informal economy, certainly exacerbated those economic inequalities. But if we look back to some of the ideas that were around at the time of NAFTA's sort of boom time, Bob Pastor, who was both of our advisors, who led the Center for North American Studies at American University, was the first to suggest that North America should look to Europe's social cohesion policy as a way to address regional development inequities. Now, if we look back to what the EU did for its original 6 members, Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, in the Netherlands, if we look back, they had vast gaps in development after World War II. And to address this, a cohesion policy was developed that would support specific cities and regions through funds that would allow the member states to invest in social and economic development, infrastructure, environmental initiatives, and transport. Now, when the EU expanded to include 10 countries from the much poorer Central and Eastern European places, the cohesion policy was one tool that helped close some of those gaps as well. Now, that policy was not perfect, and successful implementation required institutional capabilities to monitor and to carry out those projects. But I think lessons from those efforts could still be applied to North America today, borrowing from Bob's idea. So for instance, if we look at initiatives that we have the North American Development Bank, but it only covers environmental infrastructure projects in the US-Mexico border region through loans and grants. It has modest funds and a limited but highly committed staff. And if you look at its project portfolio, the NAD Bank has concentrated benefits in small handfuls of areas and sectors. For example, 77% of the loans and grants have gone towards wind and solar energy projects. So some have said we should expand the NAD Bank. I think the solution may not be expanding the NAD Bank because it likely does not have the capacity to take on more projects and to administer them if the scope was increased to cover disadvantaged regions in all 3 countries. It may be worthwhile instead to first develop and think about what a cohesion strategy in North America would look like. What would be the key priorities for the 3 countries? And then we could start to use and build upon existing institutions such as the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and the U.S. Development Finance Corporation to fund specific projects. I think that defining what our priorities are as a region when it comes to social and economic development would help to focus our attention on projects that would contribute to advancing those specific goals. That would include helping towns that lose manufacturing facilities or that have difficulties in redefining themselves in a new competitive global environment. And alongside this, I would say that diversifying the institutional catalog, so we're not just relying on the old NAFTA institutions, could actually help us tackle more ambitious projects with adequate staffing and monitoring that could ensure long-term success. Importantly, the funds need to go towards a variety of projects beyond infrastructure and environment. It could include things like workforce training and higher education. That's what worked in the EU's cohesion policy. And I think that these efforts could help reduce economic disparities, increase opportunity, and support a more stable social landscape on the continent. It could also assist in addressing the challenges posed by migration by creating economic opportunities in Mexico so that people aren't forced to look elsewhere to make a living to support their families. Now, I just want to touch on one more issue area, the third where I think we can learn from some new recent efforts in the EU on the climate space, mainly to establish a carbon border adjustment mechanism to complement its internal emissions trading scheme. Now, within the EU, there is a cap and trade emissions trading system that covers emissions from the electricity sector, selected energy-intensive industries, and aviation. Companies have to buy what are called emissions allowances, one of which gives them the right to emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. Emissions from power and industry plants have been reduced by 37% through the EU's emissions trading system since 2005. And the revenue that's generated from that goes back to member states to use for investments in renewable energy, improving energy efficiency, or investing in low carbon technologies. Now, to support its internal carbon market, the EU recently established what's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is going to tax imports of products from specific high emission sectors such as steel, aluminum, and cement at a rate equivalent to its domestic carbon price. This way, a level playing field is created between European and foreign producers, and carbon leakage, whereby EU producers shift their production to another country to avoid the ETS, but sell those products back to the EU, can be entirely avoided. Now, when you look at what's going on in North America, the United States does not have an emissions trading system, although some states have implemented one. Furthermore, there are regional initiatives, including the Western Climate Initiative, which includes some US states and some Canadian provinces. Canada implemented a carbon pricing system in 2019 that allows its provinces and territories some flexibility in how to design it. And Mexico actually launched its emissions trading system in 2020. It's still in its pilot phase, but it is developing. So I think that this is one of those new emerging areas which is quite ripe for cooperation. And there seems to be a political interest in this here in the United States as well. If we look at some recent bills that have come before Congress that have been looking at a carbon border adjustment mechanism, the one that's probably closest to what the European Union is doing is that bill that's from Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and Senator Susan DelBene, which is the Clean Competition Act. And this aims to incentivize industrial decarbonization through a narrow domestic carbon tax, $55 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent starting from 2025, focused on a set of covered goods that participate in the EPA's greenhouse gas reduction program. That includes things like fossil fuels, aluminum, iron, steel, and pulp and paper. Now, this would be calculated as an industry-specific average of carbon intensity of which firms would pay a tax if it exceeded that average, and it would be mirrored by an import tax similar to the EU CBAM. Now, this is not to say that we need a single way to do this in North America, but the fact that we're at the beginning stages of discussing this here in the United States, and Canada has already done a lot to develop its own ETS, as has Mexico, neither of them have actually established a carbon border adjustment mechanism, though they have been considering it. I think this is the time when coordination would be very helpful, not just to avoid carbon leakage through USMCA, but also to ensure that pricing is consistent in sectors that are heavily traded between our three countries. Now, let me just have a few concluding thoughts, and then we'll go to Q&A. I think that there are many small details into how such policies could be pursued, but the technical aspects are the problems that I think that we can be solving if we just put our minds to achieving really shared objectives in these areas. The big takeaway, I hope, is that North American regionalism is first limited by our imaginations, and second, by our willingness to see each other as friends rather than foreigners. Our countries are physically bound to each other, and our linkages, economic, political, and cultural, run very deep. So to revitalize North American integration, we have to kind of go back to our old ideas, but with a view to how they can succeed given the realities of today. So I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Greg.
Oh, if I can get off mute here. Thank you so much. That was excellent. Tom was wonderful. Folks, if we have some questions, again, just remind you to drop them into the chat. And while I go through that chat, I would, actually, I've got one in the chat that's already here from Peter, who said EP or ETPs have been used for criteria pollutants in the US. Are you referring only to the carbon emissions? And I guess, Anu, this is for you.
Yes, I'm referring to carbon emissions and expanding the current environmental schemes that have already been developed within certain regions. California has an emissions trading system, for example, which is probably more comprehensive than some other states, but certainly expanding it to include carbon emissions and other pollutants as well.
Thank you. So again, questions in the chat, or if you'd just like to raise your hand and not have me murder the question when I read it, then feel free to do so. I have a couple questions that came up into mind, and I guess for either one of you, any thoughts on the value or interest in expanding membership to include other Central or South American countries? And if so, how might that take place?
Yeah, I'm glad to speak to that. I'm not sure that Inu and I will have the same response on this, but so you know, I tend to think that we need to adopt what Richard Feinberg has called a wider aperture on North America, and that doesn't necessarily mean including kind of bringing states into the USMCA, though initially there was some interest in that proposal in the years right after NAFTA. There was interest from Chile in kind of becoming a NAFTA member from afar in one way or another. But what we've ended up with, kind of instead of that, or instead of the free trade agreement of the Americas, has been this patchwork of different free trade agreements that I think has complicated efforts to build a more cohesive regional platform. So I think it was maybe the last event in the seminar. Some of the members of the audience might have been there, where Karina Stark Fernandez was talking about a very ambitious version for this, but which might be a bit beyond what I see as most Latin American countries is desiring, but certainly looking for ways to make the existing network of free trade agreements more compatible, I think could build a much stronger North America by bringing in kind of lower value segments of global value chains, for example. I also think that it's really important to start thinking of other policy challenges in that respect, because it's clear that the line of North America when it comes to lots of transnational challenges, but migration, environmental issues, drug trafficking, right? These do not stop at Mexico's southern border, and so finding ways to expand productive North American dialogues, I think is absolutely crucial.
Wonderful. Inu, any counterpoints or agreement?
Yeah, I would say, Tom's view is probably won out over time. And so congratulations on that. It is interesting because there are various views on how to deal with this. If we look at what the Biden administration is doing in the Americas today, they are thinking broader and more regionally in a wider sense, thinking through how the connectivities through all the countries in Latin America do impact the United States, and therefore you need a policy that covers that. So the Americas Prosperities for Economic, America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, getting all my acronyms straight, is one of the ways that they're trying to do that. I think, though, at the same time, there are things that we're going to want to do just with the three original NAFTA partners, and perhaps use that space as a way to experiment, as somewhat of an engine to see where we can actually move some ideas forward. And it just makes sense because we are so close together and we have a history of cooperation. But I think that in the long run, we are going to need to think bigger about how we deal with these issues.
Wonderful, thank you. I have a question from Juan Villa, and he was asking, are there any initiatives to expand the North American Development Bank's mandate to become a more North American infrastructure bank?
Yeah, so when NAFTA was being renegotiated, there were folks who had called for this. That was ignored. And I think it's quite unfortunate that those calls were ignored. To make any changes now would be quite difficult because in implementing legislation, it clearly specifies the limited role for the NAD Bank. So I think it's going to be quite challenging to change it unless we reopen bits of the USMCA, which we could do during the sunset review. But I think it'd be highly unlikely just because Congress is quite a stickler on appropriations for this initiative.
Great. Tom, anything to add or?
No, I leave that one to Inu.
Perfect.
And I think there might be a bit of a chance to pick up on an aspect of it with this next question.
All right, and Greg or Gregory, do you want to go ahead and just get on the open the mic and ask this question? It's a fairly involved question, and I don't want to ruin it by misstating something.
Oh, how nice of you. Good afternoon. Thank you for the talk. I do appreciate it. Basically, my question was asking, when you talk about the free trade agreement, it's obviously going from where something is created to raw materials, wherever it's developed, the EPA and whatever the environmental impacts are. In my mind, it was much like you brought up about the peso crisis. Economically speaking, labor of the people can be exploited in a much different aspect to create something. But then when you're dealing with free trade, the United States or whomever, even Canada, would purchase product X at a lower cost because that's the way of doing business. And then there would be a markup from capitalism to sell that product in the final state. And my question was, is there something that, because I'm not aware of it within the EU, because they went to a single monetized system, where something developed in a lower economic aspect, wherever that may be, Canada, United States, Mexico, where the final sale of that particular product is somehow related back to a GST so that the labor can benefit from the item in its final purchase back to where it started. Without something like that, it would be hard to see how labor under, I know it's a communistic thinking, but my aspect is it's hard to see where labor is ever going to come out of the proverbial hole that they're in if they're not able to in some way benefit from the final sale of the item in an agreement. That was where I was going with that.
Yeah, I like this. I like this question, right? I like this question a lot because I think that it gets to some of the challenges that North America has faced in terms of the perceptions of its value, of its legitimacy, some of the blowback against NAFTA from the very beginning. It also reminds me of an article written by sort of two very famous IR scholars who said the liberal international order is rigged. Fix it or watch it wither, essentially, right? And part of that is that as long as at least the perception is that labor is always losing out in free trade, there's going to be backlash against agreements like NAFTA or the USMCA. I think the kind of the empirical picture is quite a bit more nuanced. Often, if you look at the Mexican experience, labor conditions in export-oriented industries are, yes, not as high as in the United States, but higher than in domestically oriented industries. So often wages are higher in export industries in Mexico. One other way to I think address this harks a little bit back to what Inu is saying, which is that you need to have mechanisms that address externalities of different types in a sense through raising standards, yes, and also through creating mechanisms for greater social cohesion that actually lift development. Despite NAFTA helped turn Mexico into a manufacturing power instead of an oil exporting power, which I think is generally a positive shift, but it did not fulfill a lot of the promises and dreams of really closing the wage gap, for example, between Mexico and the United States, right? And I think part of that is not just kind of because of NAFTA, it's because of the limits of NAFTA. NAFTA wasn't designed to do those things and therefore didn't. And so if we're rethinking North America, I agree with you, Greg, we need to rethink it in a way that does those. If not, it will be imperiled by its failure to do so.
Any other comments? We have about a minute left.
Yeah, I think Tom covered it well.
Perfect. Okay, good.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today. This has been a fantastic session. So Tom, Inu, thank you so much. We'll have this recording up on our website as soon as that magic happens, but that should be within the week. And again, I thank you for your time and wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you next week, Inu.